Hello and welcome to this episode of the Global Innovators in Business series. In this series, we bring leaders and innovators from different fields to share their advice and experiences with undergraduate students to provide inspiration and motivation during the pandemic. We're so happy to have with us Irving Fain. Irving is the founder and CEO of Bowery Farming, a cutting-edge vertical farming company that is revolutionizing the way we grow foods. Today's discussion not only covers the traditional founder story, but also how to provide healthy, quality, and sustainable food at scale. Welcome, Irving.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
Tell us about Bowery Farming. So tell us about the company, give us like the backdrop and context of what you guys do.
And I think the additional context is I was looking at what was happening around the world, and you've got an exploding global population, which is going to reach somewhere between 9 and 10 billion people by 2050. And according to the UN, we'll need somewhere between 50 to 70% more food to feed the global population fairly. I would never suggest that one company or even one industry is going to solve that problem. There's lots of ways that we need to solve this problem. And we need to reduce food waste. We need to help developing countries increase yields. But we do need more net new supply as well. And what really drove me to Bowery specifically, because I initially looked across the entire agricultural ecosystem, was this fact that over the next 20, 30 years, 75 to 80% of the population is going to be living in and around cities. And so there's this real move towards urbanization across the world. And there's some countries, if you look at a place like China, where that has happened in spades much more quickly. You see it happening in the US, you see it happening all over the world. And so I became really obsessed with this question of how do you provide fresh food to urban environments? And how do you do that in a way that's not only more efficient, but more sustainable?
Going into the supply chain side, what did this shift into vertical agriculture mean for the supply chain context to a regular produce that we see in a grocery store? How is it different from something that we would see from Bowery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And then the starting point is you hit the nail on the head. We are absolutely reimagining farming. Come to one of our farms and it does not look like old McDonald's farm is what I would tell you. But the reimagination of farming is actually just a part of what we do, which enables us to actually reinvent the entirety of the supply chain. And what we're doing is really building a shorter, simpler, a safer supply chain, a much more sustainable supply chain, and ultimately providing surety of supply around a system that increasingly has much less surety than we've ever lived with before. And that's one of the really important values that we can deliver. And I'll talk about the other attributes, but we're just living in an increasingly uncertain and unreliable world around us right now. It feels, certainly for me, it is multiple times a week where you wake up and hear about a climactic disruption or a geopolitical issue or problems in the supply chains or with input costs. And the disruption we're seeing and feeling is substantial and compounding. And you don't have to look much further than the food system to really see that take shape. And even just in the crops that we sell today, there's massive challenges in the fields in California and even right now in Arizona around whether it be drought conditions or disease that are wiping out large portions of crops. And so you heard earlier this year, there were shortages on sriracha. I'm a big hot sauce fan. Why? Because it was really difficult to grow hot peppers in the South and in Mexico. And it's just these climatic disruptions in agriculture are increasing. And so the ability to provide surety of supply in critical products for consumers, but also the grocery store, in and of itself is very important.
Do you share, like, how did you find your way to pursuing the thing that most closely resembles what you're passionate about, and what kind of advice would you give for students still looking for that?
Yeah, one of the vectors that I paid a lot of attention to when I was exploring ideas was how I graphed my level of enthusiasm over time. And what I mean by that is, especially in a world that we're in now where there's lots and lots of early stage capital sort of searching for new ideas, right? And you know, it's not easy, but you can certainly get people to finance and buy into and get excited about an idea relatively early on. And what I've always found is that there's different curves of ideas, right? Some ideas you get really excited about and then you quickly lose interest. Other ideas you get really excited about and then your excitement kind of plateaus. Other ideas you get really excited about and then over time your excitement dwindles. And so what you can see happen sometimes is people get to that sort of peak of excitement and they say, okay, I'm going to do this. close towards the peak, and they haven't given themselves enough time to see what's going to happen with enough time elapsing. Is the excitement going to get maintained? Is it going to increase? Is it going to decrease? Is it going to drop off? And so for me personally, I really focused on, as I narrowed myself down, I first of all kept a wide aperture. I started at agriculture broadly, and I looked at things like drones on the farm, satellite imagery, and farm management software, and automation, and what was happening with tractors. And for various reasons, those ideas I thought were really compelling. I just wasn't sure I was the best person to execute on those ideas. And through that exploration, I found myself to what we're building at Bowery. But as I said, I looked at trash and recycling. I was thinking about all different areas. I kept myself open, and I started to spend more and more time on the concept of Bowery, while I simultaneously looked at other things, and I narrowed. But even while I was working on Bowery, I really spent a lot of time and energy thinking about, could you do this economically viably? How so? If you could, you scale it? And I personally had resisted taking on any capital until I felt like I had sufficiently answered those questions. Different people have different strategies there, but I think the bigger point is, and it's a balance, because you can also find people spending way too much time at some point analyzing an idea. And analysis does get asymptotic at some point, right? There is very much a point of diminishing returns in analysis of an idea. And you have to be careful not to cross over to that range. But the more time I spent thinking about working at Bowery, the less time I wanted to spend on other things, and the more excited I got. And it became clear at some point that my excitement was only increasing. And that for me was a huge driver.